Josh, we are at a tremendous disadvantage by not being forced to make a sacrifice. By not having a tie-in to our past, to our ancestors, and even to our future, we have to face this atomization of individualization. And that is fundamentally a bad thing, despite what we otherwise have been told.
Bloom makes the statement that back in the 80s, his students, their parents would make sacrifices for them without anything in return, but the students feel no obligation to make any sacrifice towards anything. The individual is key. The relationship from the individual to the family almost means nothing after college. The relationship to the state means virtually nothing, as everybody is an individual and they care for themselves and nobody else therefore.
Yeah. Well, this is not an economics video. One of the key themes we've talked about is what constrains the balance sheet of a financial institution. Likewise, we can also ask the question, what constrains individualism on the individual level? And to this point, if you go back to the generation that lived through the Great Depression, fought World War II, etc., they went through hard times, and part of the human condition in a very strange way, it's the hard times that bind us together. It's the hard times that give us the bedrock collateral, in a sense, that we can build our relationships upon. If you don't have that, particularly in the formative years, as the boomers did, those would be Bloom students in the 70s and perhaps maybe the 80s, or that might have been Gen Xers at that point in time. But if you don't have that going through, you have this preoccupation and this focus, this tremendous focus on the individual at the expense of the collective. Now, to be clear, you do not want the collective to run rampant over the individual, but at the same time, you don't want the individual to run rampant over the collective. If I could share a quote right here, Bloom mentions that this indeterminate or open-ended future and the lack of a binding past mean that the souls of young people are in a condition like that of the first men in the state of nature. In other words, there's nothing, these people, in this case, with these students in the 80s, born in maybe, the 60s or whatever, right? They never had to go through anything that would kind of like link them back to their past. They never had something to explain to them, like, this is you, and yes, you are an individual, and of course that's important, and as an individual you have your preferences and so on, but you're also a member of a group. You're a member of a family, you're a member of a state, you're a member of a country. I think Bezdemov talking about instilling the love of country in their own would be an example of this. From the collective. And so the point is that you have people who have grown up, but they haven't been integrated and brought into the society as a whole. Because when you bring someone into the society as a whole, or when you say you're part of a country, you're part of a family or whatever, the cool thing about, so the plus is that you kind of have, a focus, you have various goals that people are aiming towards, but at the same time, you also have constraints on the individual too. And ever since perhaps the 70s, definitely the 80s, and very much since in the 80s, you've had this swing of the pendulum to very much focus on the individual being unconstrained versus the collective, or versus whatever the collective might constrain on the individual. Josh.
Bloom was out to dinner with a colleague of his where she was talking about her son, how he had no ambition. He was going from job to job along with all of his friends, his son's friends. They had no drive, no purpose. And he asked, well, why do you think that is? Without hesitation, his colleague said, nuclear war. This pondered Bloom. He then went into class the next day and asked his students, well, how much of any of you think about nuclear war, or does it keep you up at night? To where Justin can give a much better quotation than that.
I think the students giggled. And as Bloom said, the students knew very much what they thought about on a regular basis, and nuclear war was not part of it. But let's go back to that key thing. When Bloom was having dinner with his faculty colleagues, and that woman mentioned that her son had no drive or ambition, what goes on that front is that it would be the family, or perhaps maybe the society at large saying, like, listen, you can choose what you want to do as a profession, but whatever you do as a profession, you need to do something, right? You need to hunker down. If that means like not going out and partying every night or whatever, right? Or maybe at least during, school nights or whatever, right? You kind of need to do that or whatever, right? And yes, you, the individual, have to sacrifice for the greater good so that you can, get your career launched as a lawyer or doctor or whatever. But I also think that it's very hard to ask someone to make a sacrifice if they don't see an ideal. And this is where it gets back to Bloom, where he constantly talks about, a unfurnished soul. Josh, before we went on the air here, I just thought up the analogy of, imagine you're some fat ass, living off, I don't know, mega stuffed Oreos or whatever, right? Okay, so then if somebody comes along and says, hey, listen, Mr. Fattest, whatever, right? You need to make a sacrifice and stop eating Oreos because, yeah, I mean, they can make a very convincing argument. Yeah, it's bad for you, etc. I mean, just look at the ingredients. And if you ever want to be disgusted, look at the ingredients of Oreos, separate video. But the point is that, like, if you tell that person they need to make a sacrifice, so the individual will want to eat Oreos, they don't want to be constrained. But if you tell that individual, like, no, you need to make a sacrifice, you need to constrain your wants, you also have to give them a reason to do that. So in this particular case, it's like, hey, if you constrain, get on a diet, get your ass to the gym or whatever, right? After, it'll take some time, it'll take some sacrificing, but hey, look at what you can look like. Like, look at this, picture right here. Here's, a buff guy or a buff girl, or depending on the situation, of course, whatever that's going on there. And this is why you need these ideals, to look up to. We haven't gotten into it yet, but Bloom talks about, like, man, with his tension can shoot a star, can string a bow and shoot a star, and shoot like an arrow with a star into the dark night sky to lead man, or to give man something to look up to. And so in this regard, well, individualism is very, there's some pluses of individualism. Like if you want to chow down on the Oreos and think that you're healthy at any size, okay, well, great. That's pure individualism. But there's also a bigger thing. I think this is where Bloom comes back into saying, listen, if you can't integrate the reason that the society or the family or even the state needs to constrain the individual, if you can't explain that in a way that resonates with the soul, no one's going to pay any attention to it. So of course, how does Bloom say it right here? Why are we surprised when such unfurnished persons should be preoccupied principally with themselves? Well, of course, they're not going to give up their Oreos, not going to give up smoke or anything like that, because they have no ideal. They have nothing to look up to.
This goes back to the theme of virtue in the soul and to discrimination about bad things and to have a universal agreement that some things are objectively not good or in some things are good, but without the rationale and explanation upon why some things are good and why some things are bad. Back to the analogy. Yes, okay, you are eating a mega stuffed Oreos every day, and that's fine. You, as an individual, have the choice to do that. But as Bloom constantly hammers down, you cannot then say, Justin, you are not eating mega stuffed Oreos, therefore you are bad. Because it is not good to eat those mega stuffed Oreos. And you have to be aware that you are doing something morally not good. That is not a healthy thing to do for your body.
Objectively, it is objectively not a good thing to do. And there's other things too where you can say it is probably objectively good to not be promiscuous as a society. Oh, I said it, Josh. I shouldn't say that, but I said it. Anyways,
I don't even know what that means. But it's okay. Bloom then goes on to say they can be anything they want to be, but they have no particular reason to want to be anything particular at all. This because the wanting to be something particular, that might constrain the individual. Just like banks are loath to have their balance sheets constrained, the individual is loath to have their options, maybe is the way to say it, or like whatever constraint. But the thing is, you need some constraint on this, just like you need some creativity. Like, forgive me for making an economics example to explain philosophy here, but like you want banks and financial institutions to be able to expand their balance sheets within reason. You want the individual to be able to be unconstrained within reason. That's not to say 100% unconstrained, but there are some constraints that we all stop at red lights and go at green lights. You even stop at a red light if no one else is coming and it's 3 a.m. in the morning. Why do you do it? Because in the big picture, you make the sacrifice, but you can see how the sacrifice makes sense. And no, you don't automatically always stop at a red light if there's a cop or an ambulance or a fire truck. Well, no, you make a decision to get out of the way too, but this is just being an adult. Anyways, traffic rant. Listening to this really it gave me some internal struggles of my own as I lean extraordinarily libertarian. I believe in the individual's right to choose what they want to do and be. And after hearing Bloom hammer down on what is the purpose of these other factors, such as my relationship to my family, my relationship to the state.
Yeah. So, but Josh, this is what I would say. If Gaiman will forgive me for stealing a page from his book, which I think is a very appropriate page, it's all about personal freedom and liberty, personal freedom and liberty. 100% agree. No disagreement on that front. But again, go back to my silly example of stopping at red lights and going at green lights. Hear me out. Hear me out. You are constrained. Your personal liberty and freedom are constrained at 3 o'clock in the morning when it's only your dumb ass on the road and you're stopping at a red light. That's a really long red light for a minute or whatever, right? And it's true, it's constrained. But at the end of the day, if we simply did away with all the traffic lights before, assuming we didn't have like self-driving cars or, something like that or whatever. The point is right now, if we did away with all the traffic lights or whatever, or just imagine like the lights going out or whatever, right? It's utter chaos. And so the point is that there's a time and a place for constraints to be implied. Because if you really want personal freedom and liberty, the maximum amount of exposure of that, it does make sense to perhaps have some limitation, to perhaps have some restraints and constraints on this, because in the end, you net so much more back. I mean, like, I think that's the way that I would say it. And so, like, it's not so much like, oh, the state is automatically bad. There's a time and a place for it, but at the same time too, we have to be incredibly careful, because I think, and I suspect you'd agree with me, like in the West, the state generally tends to be good at giving people what they need. We need a military, we need roads, we need an FAA, etc., or whatever, right? The state sucks at giving people what they want, and that would be like catering to emotions, making people feel like the state's absolutely horrible about that. Now, companies, by the way, are really good at that. Nabisco, if you don't think they have a crack team of scientists trying to figure out how to make Oreos as addictive as they can, yeah, of course they're doing that. And shame on them. They know exactly what they're doing. But
Yeah, that's a great the free market. They will find what you want and they will provide it. The government provides you with what you need. These
Yeah.
roads, the police, the firefighters, and that is the key.
Collective defense.
Like
Yeah.
the key points is the relationship to the state, the relationship to the family. He also went on and said, people today, once they go to university, their ties to their family are almost universally cut off, and you maybe see them a few times a year after, but you go to college, you move on, you usually move out of state, and you often don't see the people that you grew up with anymore.
So it's interesting too. I would say since then, I'd be really curious to see what Bloom would think about social media since then, because so growing up, both my parents were in oil and gas. I guess they still are or whatever, but they were road warriors back in the day. And so like from my perspective, like, and like some mom's from California, dad's from Virginia. And so we grew up here in Texas. And so like from my perspective, it's like, oh, you just get on a plane. I mean, like that's like, it's like, oh, of course you just do. Or Josh, I'm coming up to visit you. Just get on a plane. I'll have a good dinner or whatever, right? So I think that there's definitely something to that. But I would say it's one of these interesting things, because when you see distances shrink in the terms of, it's just a 3-hour or 2-hour plane flight, and assuming the prices aren't astronomical, or even just like right now in StreamYard or whatever, right? You can do FaceTime. Or of course, it's much more fun to, talk in person. But still, like, you have these interesting substitutions which help ameliorate, the distance. They don't resolve it, nor are they complete substitute, but they definitely help take the edge off. Yeah.
This was Closing of the American Mind, Chapter 4, Relationships by Dr. Alan Bloom. And highly recommend it. This book is just absolutely fantastic. I mean, me and Justin had to do a few takes on this, as it is extremely dense. I mean, we are trying to simplify this, and I know what you're saying. What the hell? I don't even know the 5 words that you said in this, but
we don't either. Well, like I said, how many chapters do we have left? Like 30 chapters, and we're not going to do another GME video until we've done all 30 chapters. No, just kidding.
Yeah. So if you like these videos, let us know. We're going to continue to do them even if you don't like them, because we enjoy doing them and we learn a lot through them.
There will come a time, once GME has squoze, and people suddenly have, they are no longer, there we go, there's a constraint. They're no longer as constrained by let's say the financial dimension of life, and they will suddenly be faced with what I call the now what problem. And this is, I think, is a particularly good example of where Bloom can be so revelatory or whatever. Like it is so important, because it helps explain to someone, like, listen, these are the various things you can do once you get tired of, hookers and blow, assuming it doesn't kill you after, 1 week of doing it. So have your fun, but then, you're gonna have to go on and, become an adult.
So thank you very much for watching, and we will see you guys on the next one.